Well, the battle against ISIL is taking place on many fronts. In addition to U.S. airstrikes, French warplanes are now pounding terrorist positions there. And while details are still sketchy, the Turkish government is crediting its intelligence services for this week's hostage rescue. 49 people, including diplomats and their families, were seized when ISIL raided the Turkish consulate in Mosul 3 months ago. Well, in Australia, a series of police raids rounded up 15 suspected of taking part in a plot to randomly kidnap and kill strangers in the name of ISIL. Videos of the beheadings were then supposed to be posted on the internet. And at the United Nations, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called for a global effort to fight the terror group. He was welcomed in any and all partners, even Iran. Listen.
It's about taking out an entire network, decimating and discrediting a militant cult masquerading as a religious movement. The fact is, there is a role for nearly every country in the world to play, including Iran, whose foreign minister is here with us today.
Well, the role Turkey is playing is complex and crucial. Since the civil war in Syria began 3 years ago, Turkey has taken in almost 1 million refugees. In fact, it's reported that just in the last 24 hours, almost 70,000 more refugees fleeing ISIL have poured across their border. Well, that's causing a somewhat confusing situation in Turkey. Turkish forces are using water cannons and tear gas to disperse supporters of Kurdish fighters. Turkey says it's trying to prevent Kurds from going back into Syria to fight ISIL. Well, Eric Ham reports for The Hill and focuses on ISIL. Of course, Eric, you're always welcome here.
Thank you.
Is the international community finally uniting against ISIL, in your opinion?
Absolutely, they are. And we're seeing this take place both in the UN, and we've seen John Kerry do just an amazing job traveling around the globe, aligning countries to actually take the fight to ISIL. And I think now ISIL is actually beginning to feel some of the heat, which is why I think we're seeing them kind of ramp up their efforts, not just in the Middle East, but in countries like Australia.
Interesting to see that Secretary of State John Kerry, crisscrossing across his continent 1 billion times, is now looked at, I guess, with some credibility these days.
Absolutely, he is. I mean, because you got to look at this effort is primarily been on his shoulders to bring many of these countries together. And we're actually seeing him do kind of like diplomatic backflips, you know, working with countries that are not necessarily in line with one another. Many are very concerned about Iran and Iran's a role in this. Right. And then also, too, you've got to look at the role that General John Allen is going to play as an envoy working directly with Kerry on the whole coordination of this entire operation.
Indeed. You know, I want to focus on Turkey in a minute here. We've talked about it, but I just want to can't underscore what I believe to me is the international threat when you have a country like Australia weeding out folks that are possibly tied to ISIL. What's your thought on that?
Well, Australia has been very active both in its humanitarian aid and its military aid to Iraq, combating ISIL. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why you see Australia now coming under threat, not necessarily from ISIL fighters heading to Australia, but jihadists who support the ISIL mission in Australia. Because Australia has been very active, one of our more active partners fighting on the ground in Iraq. And so I think that's why you're beginning to see, like I said, this ramped up effort from either ISIL or ISIL sympathizers beyond Iraq and the Middle East in places like Australia.
Now, you mentioned, Eric, ramped up effort here, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on Turkey. You know, they have a large border there that's certainly been compromised, you know, hundreds of thousands of refugees coming across their border, and certain security concerns. Of course, you know, they've been Turkey over the years have not been very supportive of the United States using their bases for airstrikes. How do you think they're going to get more involved in this particular effort?
Well, since the release of these hostages, there have been more questions, I think, than answers, although this is, and many may think that now that Turkey has these hostages in their care and they're back home, right, that we may begin to see a more ramped up effort, or we may see Turkey play a more proactive role with this coalition. But I think there are still many questions left unanswered, particularly around how ISIL, with all of its infrastructure and its fierce fighting, would actually give up, a major bargaining chip to Turkey, because now, as myself and other experts have said, Turkey is an integral part of this coalition to fight ISIL.
Right.
So for ISIL to give up these hostages, I think that just begs many questions that need to be answered going forward, and that'll determine where Turkey in fact lies in either with the coalition or just on the sidelines.
Right. We've got less than a minute left. Of course, my buddy here, James Carville, is going to talk about the political ramifications of this in a few minutes here. But real quickly at the end here, in terms of ISIL being an international threat, there's still some people who say perhaps not. What are your thoughts about that?
We don't necessarily, ISIL is a threat, make no question about it. They've got enormous resources, but what you need to be concerned about, and what many countries need to think about and be concerned about, is the sympathizers, particularly in Western countries, namely the United States and the UK, who sympathize and support ISIL's mission. That's the concern that we need to be watching out for.
Okay, Eric, of course, we could go on forever and ever on this, but thank you so much for your insight, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Important as international support is for President Obama's pledge to destroy ISIL, he also needs domestic support as well. Well, in a Congress that has a track record of voting strictly along party lines these days, the president rounded up some surprising allies and adversaries at the same point. Rise News' senior political analyst James Carville joins us again. James, the vote to destroy and degrade ISIL, the president actually really got some support, some bipartisan support for this.
There was also some bipartisan support not to have the Congress authorize it. Okay, I mean, no one understand it, because if this goes bad, then the Congress wants to say, we never did do that. I mean, it's a little, I think it's a little strange that we're sending these combat pilots into war, because let's not make no mistake about it, we're bombing people. And yet we didn't feel like we could get congressional authorization for this action, which I think would have been important to have a debate.
Well, I have to ask James, do you think it was wise of the president to say that, look, I really don't need congressional support for this move? How wise was it of him to say that?
Well, I think that the Congress wanted him to say that, because everybody, it was a kind of a little rigged game here, where you say that you don't need congressional support, and we'll say you don't need congressional support. That way we won't have to debate this and argue about it. And if you stop and you think about it, we started bombing in the Middle East 13 years ago, coming up October next month. It's 13 years later, we're still bombing. What's a depressing thought? 13 years from now, we're still going to be bombing.
But here's the deal, though. We've got primarily, from most polls, indicate that the American public is behind this.
Right.
Of course, until maybe a plane gets shot down, or perhaps maybe until boots might go on the ground. Now, General Martin Dempsey, in hearings, basically said that, look, that could be a possibility, but it's up to the president. Do you think that we can actually win a war like this or a conflict like this without having our own boots on the ground over there in the Middle
Henry
East?
Ford famously said, if he'd have asked the American public what they wanted, they would have answered faster horses. Okay? I mean, you can't, at some point, yes, there was this horrid beheading that the American public saw that changed their attitudes toward this almost overnight. But you're right, the first pilot that goes down and is taken prisoner, the first boot on the ground, which seems to be the sort of in vogue expression, or something goes wrong, or we just continue this war and something happens on another front, or God forbid there's an attack here in the United States, just as they were trying in Australia. You can't discount that possibility. I wouldn't, public opinion in a war is a fragile thing. I wouldn't build a whole lot on that.
All right, but what about political opinion or political pushback on this? We do have somewhat, of a bipartisan support for going over there. What's the political thought behind this? I mean, we're in midterms, the whole big. Explain it.
Well, first of all, he had to do something. That the beheadings had what I suspect was their desired effect. So it was now, here we stand, if not now, when? If not us, who? We're on the precipice, we got to kill somebody.
I don't want to make light of this, but
I'm not making light of it.
No, but I'm saying this is almost like the Ray Rice effect. You see the punch. Right. Okay, so you see the beheadings here, and all of a sudden now people are alarmed, they're up in arms. Right.
So they had to do something, and this constitutes something. And I agree, and they had to do support when they were in making these gains in Iraq, to support the Kurds, the Peshmerga. They're having to do a lot of different things. I'm just saying, we've been at this for 13 years. It's sort of depressing to think that we're going to probably be there for another 13. And absent a better idea, I guess we have to do this, and I don't have a better idea, and apparently neither does anybody else.
It's a sobering thought, but what we do have again, and I say again, and I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, this coalition of the willing, and we're talking about boots on the ground, but no one has really said, James, as far as I have heard or seen or read anywhere, who's putting boots on the ground? No one's coming forth with this information.
You asked the right but uncomfortable question. And whose boot is going to go on the ground? But you had the former Secretary of Defense, you had General Dempsey, because the president says that we're going to cripple and destroy, exact the words he used. And they're saying, and probably correctly, although I'm not a military person, that you can't do that unless you have boots on the ground. I mean, we always start out is we're just going to go in as advisors. We're going to do a little surgical strike here, and everything is going to be fine. And the next thing you know, a mission,
right.
Yeah, more like a mission run-up. And people have become, understandably, very politically, and we're just talking politically here, very skeptical of that, and we know that the president on some of these issues is likely to change his mind.
I've got one last question for you.
Sure.
We've run out of time, but my producer, Alan Weiss, has given me a little bit more time, thank goodness.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, look, we've got a situation here where it's very fragile. We could be opening up another can of worms. We don't know if we give support to any of these rebels, if they're really going to be for us, or not for us, or for the Allies,
right.
bite the Allies back. How do we win in this situation?
I don't know. No one has told me how do we know when we won? If you play a soccer match, a football match, at the end of the day, one side has green jerseys, one side has blue jerseys, and you know. Well, here, they don't wear jerseys, and you don't know when you won. Who's probably going to win? Who wins every time we go to war? The Iranians. Okay? Every year they won in Iraq. They probably won in Afghanistan. And probably to some extent, Assad will win because ISIS, we're trying to hurt them who's trying to hurt him. And it's a very, 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 very complicated world. And we've been in war there for a long time, and I hate to say it, but it sure looks like we're in war there.
Certainly a lot of water cooler talk and talk over coffee. James Carville, as always, sir. Thank you.
Always good interview. Enjoy it. Thank you, sir. You bet.